She was beaten. She was tied, and she was left to die slowly, hanging from a tree in the middle of a forest so dark it felt like the earth had swallowed the sun. Emily Carter's wrists were screaming, torn raw by thick ropes that stretched her arms wide on a heavy branch. Another rope bit deep into her neck, a cruel noose that forced her to push upward with trembling arms or be strangled by her own exhaustion. Her bare feet dangled inches above the ground. Her toes clawed at the empty air, desperate for something solid, something real. Blood was smeared across her legs, mixed with dirt, mixed with sweat. Her knee was a swollen knot of purple, a brand of suffering burned into her skin. Every breath was a battle, a shallow, rattling gasp. The night was dead silent, nothing but her own broken sobs and the horrible, steady creak of the rope with every small movement. But she wasn't alone. Leaning against another tree, like he was watching a Sunday picnic, stood Jack Malone. He used to be a respected rancher, a man people looked up to. Now he was nothing more than a monster poured into human skin. His eyes glittered in the moonlight, full of a sick, twisted delight. He was a predator enjoying the slow, agonizing death of his prey. Jack tilted a silver flask to his lips. He took a long, slow drink. A smirk played on his face as he watched Emily strain against the ropes, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. "You see, Emily," he whispered, his voice calm, chilling, "this isn't about killing you quick. This is about watching you break, inch by painful inch, until every last piece of your spirit is gone." He pushed off the tree, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. The sound was deafening in the silence. He stepped closer and traced a single finger along the rope that cut into her neck. She flinched, her breath catching in a sharp, terrified hiss. Jack let out a low chuckle. It was a sound colder and crueler than any shout. "This rope is my favorite," he said softly. "It gets just a little bit tighter every time you lose strength, every time your arms start to give. So you fight, Emily. You keep fighting. I want to watch you struggle until there's absolutely nothing left." Her mind was a whirlwind of pure terror and blinding pain. Her arms were on fire, every muscle screaming, begging to collapse. Her throat burned for air. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean lines through the dirt and grime. Jack just leaned back, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. He watched every twitch, every gasp, every broken, whispered plea. Hours crawled by. The moon made its slow journey across the inky black sky. Emily clung to life, fueled by a strength she didn't know she had. Her body swung gently from side to side, a broken doll on display for an audience of one. Jack never looked away. He sat on a log, sharpening a knife, humming a tuneless, awful song. His eyes were locked on her, soaking in her misery. Sometimes he'd laugh softly to himself, shaking his head like he was watching a private show put on just for him. Other times he'd mutter, his voice a low growl. She thought she could leave me. She thought she could just walk away. But nobody leaves Jack Malone. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. She whispered for mercy, a prayer she knew would never be answered. Jack rose again. His shadow stretched long and dark, covering her fragile body. He placed a hand under her chin, forcing her face up toward his. His touch was as cold and cruel as his heart. "You look beautiful like this," he said, his voice dripping with poison. "So fragile, so helpless." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. But somewhere deep inside, buried under all the pain and fear, a tiny flicker of defiance sparked to life. She wanted to scream at him, to spit in his face, but her voice was gone, broken into silence. Still, Jack saw it. He saw it in her eyes, that faint spark that refused to die, and it only fed his obsession. It only made him want to break her more. "Don't you give up yet," he said, stepping back, his grin widening into a predator's snarl. "I want to see the exact moment you surrender. That's the sweetest part." The night bled into the cold, gray light of dawn. Her body trembled, a constant, violent quake. Every breath was a shard of glass in her lungs. The ropes had cut deep into her skin, leaving marks that would never fade. She had survived the night, but her strength was gone. She was running on empty. Her arms were fire. Her body was a wreck. This was it. This was the end. And then she heard it, the sound of boots, crunching against dry leaves, slow, steady, coming closer through the trees. Her heart stopped. Was it Jack? Was he coming back to finish his twisted game, or had someone else by some miracle come into this cursed forest? A figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't Jack. This was an older man, maybe 50, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years under a hard sun. He carried himself with the quiet calm of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. Folks around town called him William Dawson, but most just called him Will. Will wasn't a saint, but he had a stubborn streak of decency in him, the kind that made him step in when everyone else looked away. His eyes fell on Emily hanging from that branch, and he froze. The sight hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of his lungs. This wasn't just cruelty. This was pure, unholy evil. He dropped the rifle he was carrying and rushed forward, his hunting knife already in his hand. "Hold on, kid," he muttered, his voice a low growl. He sawed at the thick ropes. The rope around her neck went slack. Emily gasped as the tension released, her body collapsing forward. Will caught her, his arms strong and steady around her. Her breath came in desperate, ragged gulps. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt air fill her lungs without searing pain. Will held her steady. "Easy now. You're safe. I've got you." His voice was rough, like gravel. But there was a kindness in it she hadn't heard in years, the kind that makes you believe it. But out here, safety is a flickering candle in a hurricane. The sharp crack of a gunshot ripped through the morning air. Bark exploded from the tree just inches from Will's head. Jack Malone was back. A hunting rifle was in his hand, and pure, murderous fury was blazing in his eyes. "Put her down, Dawson," Jack sneered from the tree line. "She belongs to me." Will didn't waste time with words. He shoved Emily behind him, drew his revolver with a speed that defied his age, and fired back. The bullet kicked up dirt by Jack's boots, forcing him to dive for cover. "Run!" Will yelled, grabbing Emily and pulling her toward his horse tied nearby. She was weak, her legs shaking, barely able to stand. But the raw urgency in his voice pushed her forward. Another shot rang out. Will grunted, stumbling for a step. A dark red stain blossomed on his side. The bullet had grazed him, tearing through his shirt and his skin. Pain burned hot and sharp, but he didn't slow down. He swung Emily onto the saddle, then mounted behind her in one fluid motion. The horse reared, its panicked cry echoing through the trees, then it charged down the forest trail. More bullets cracked behind them, whistling through the air. Branches whipped at their faces. The morning was filled with the smell of gunpowder and dust. Emily clung to Will, her face buried in his back, tears mixing with sweat. Her heart pounded with a terrifying mix of fear and relief. Behind them, Jack's voice echoed through the forest, a howl of pure rage. It was a promise. He wouldn't stop. Not until she was his again. Not until he had finished what he started. But as the horse galloped on, carrying her away from that nightmare, Emily knew something Jack didn't. She had escaped him once before. This time she would rather die than ever go back. The horse's hooves pounded the earth, a frantic rhythm of escape. Will held the reins tight in one hand, the other pressed hard against his bleeding side. Every jolt of the saddle sent a fresh wave of fire through his ribs, but he didn't slow. Stopping wasn't an option. Not now, maybe not ever. Emily clung to him, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. Behind them, the forest had fallen silent. Jack's furious shouts had faded away. The gunshots were gone, but silence wasn't safety. It was just a pause. Will leaned close, his voice a rough whisper in her ear. "Hold steady, kid. We just need to put some miles between us and that bastard." The horse's breath came in hot, steamy clouds in the cool morning air. Branches snagged and tore at their clothes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dense forest began to thin. The trail opened into a wide, sun-drenched clearing. Will pulled back on the reins, slowing the horse to a walk, then a stop. He slid down from the saddle first, letting out a low groan as his boots hit the dirt. The side of his shirt was soaked in blood, dark and slick. Still, he managed a crooked, tired grin. "Bullet only kissed me. I'll live." Emily followed, her own legs trembling so hard she almost fell. She looked at him, her eyes wide, still stained with the tears of the night before. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Will's grin faded. He lowered himself onto a fallen log, his face tight with pain. "That's foolish talk. I couldn't leave you hanging there. No man with a soul could." A wave of shame washed over her. Her voice dropped, heavy with a truth she had kept buried for too long. "You don't understand. Jack Malone, he wasn't just some stranger who grabbed me. He was mine once. Or I thought he was." Will's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, his gaze intense. He was listening, really listening. "At first he was gentle," she said, the words spilling out in a broken rush. "Charming. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Then I saw the truth. The darkness in him, his cruel little games. The way he'd laugh when I begged him to stop. He fed on suffering, on pain, on fear." She took a shaky breath. "When I finally ran, I thought I was free. I made it 100 miles away. But he hunted me down, like an animal. He told me he was going to finish what he started." Will spat into the dirt, a look of pure disgust on his weathered face. "So that's why he won't quit. He doesn't see you as a person. He sees you as something he owns." He shook his head slowly. "Men like that don't love. They just destroy." Emily dropped her gaze, fresh tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. "I would rather die than ever go back to him." Will reached out and placed a steady, calloused hand on her shoulder. The touch was surprisingly gentle. "Then we make sure you never do. Not while I'm still breathing." For a long moment the clearing was quiet. The two of them sat side by side, battered and bruised, two strangers bound together by a shared enemy, but this wasn't the end. They both knew it. This was just the beginning. Jack Malone was still out there, and he wasn't done hunting. But as Will looked at Emily, a strange, cold thought settled in his gut. Her face. There was something familiar about her. Not her, specifically, but the look in her eyes. The same haunted, terrified look he'd seen once before. In the eyes of his own daughter. The day she disappeared. He pushed the thought away. It was just the pain talking. It had to be. He stood up, wincing as he put weight on his injured side. "My ranch ain't far. We can rest there. Figure out what to do next." The Dawson Ranch was more of a shack than a house, a stubborn little box of wood and nails clinging to a wind-swept patch of prairie. It was isolated, lonely, and for now, it was the safest place on earth. Night fell heavy, the wind rattling the old shutters like a restless ghost. Inside, the lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Emily sat by the table, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully wrapped a clean strip of cloth around Will's wounded side. He tried to act tough, giving her that same crooked half-smile. "Don't you fuss, girl. I've had worse from a bar fight in Abilene." But she saw the sweat beading on his brow. She saw the way his body shook with tremors of pain he couldn't hide. Will Dawson was hurt bad, and they both knew it. Then came the sound, a faint crunch of gravel from the yard outside. Slow, deliberate, confident. Emily froze, the bandage slipping from her fingers. Will's hand shot out, grabbing the revolver he'd laid on the table, but his grip was unsteady, his movements slow. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his eyes locked on the door. The floorboards by the door creaked, a long, agonizing sound, and then the door swung open, and there he was. Jack Malone stepped inside. His face was half hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the predatory grin stretching across it. He looked like he owned the room, like he owned everything in it. "Well now," Jack drawled, his voice smooth as poison, "I figured I'd find you here. Did you really think you could steal her away from me, Dawson?" Will struggled to raise the revolver, but his injured arm shook, refusing to obey. Jack fired first. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The bullet slammed into Will's shoulder, spinning him around and throwing him back against the wall. He slid to the floor, a cry of pain torn from his lips. Blood spread fast, a dark flower blooming on his shirt. Emily screamed. Jack walked in slow, savoring every step. His pistol was aimed steady, moving from Will on the floor to Emily by the table. "Don't you worry, Emily," he cooed. "I ain't gonna kill him quick. Men like him, who get in my way, they deserve to suffer, just like you did." Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She looked at Will, barely conscious, his hand still struggling to lift his gun. And then she looked at Jack, the man she once thought she loved, now a devil in human skin. And in that instant, something inside her snapped. The years of fear, of pain, of humiliation, it all burned away. And in its place was a fire, a white-hot rage hotter than anything she had ever felt in her life. Her eyes darted around the room, searching. They landed on a heavy cast-iron lamp sitting on the table. With a scream that tore from the very depths of her soul, a sound of pure, primal fury, she grabbed the lamp. She swung it with all her strength. The heavy iron base smashed into the side of Jack's skull with a sickening, wet crack. His grin vanished. His eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. He stumbled back, raising a hand to his head. Emily didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. Every bruise, every scar, every terrified night fueled her attack. Years of buried pain erupted in a storm of violence. She struck him again, and again, and again. Until Jack Malone, the monster who had haunted her life, lay still on the floorboards, a pool of dark blood spreading out from beneath him. The cabin was silent. Her chest heaved, sucking in ragged breaths. Tears and sweat dripped from her face. For the first time in years, she was free. Will's weak voice broke the silence from the corner. "Emily, it's over." She dropped the bloody lamp. It clattered to the floor. Her hands were raw, her knuckles split. She rushed to Will's side, kneeling in the dirt beside him. He was pale, bleeding from 2 wounds now, but he was alive. His eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. A tired, painful smile crept across his face. "You saved me, Emily," he whispered. "No," she said, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face. "We saved each other." But as the adrenaline faded, a new, cold fear began to creep in. Jack Malone was dead. But men like Jack don't exist in a vacuum. They have friends. They have allies. And Jack was a wealthy, respected man. What happens when the law comes knocking? What happens when they find a powerful rancher brutally killed in a stranger's cabin? The story wouldn't be about her survival. It would be about her crime. Will seemed to read her mind. He pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain. "We can't stay here. The sheriff in the next town over, Brody. He was a friend of Jack's. He won't listen to a word we say." The new day brought no comfort, only the harsh reality of their situation. They were survivors, yes. But now, they were fugitives. They buried Jack's body in a shallow, unmarked grave deep in the woods behind the ranch. It felt wrong, too easy, too quiet an end for such a loud and violent man. As they shoveled the last of the dirt over him, Will paused, leaning heavily on the shovel. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "there's something I gotta ask you. When I found you, back in the forest, you had a look in your eye. I've seen it before." He took a ragged breath. "Years ago, I had a daughter, Sarah. She was about your age. One day, she just vanished. The law said she ran off with some farmhand, but I knew my Sarah. She wouldn't have done that." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "The last time I saw her, she'd been seeing a new rancher who'd just bought the land next to ours, a man named Jack Malone." Emily's blood ran cold. The whole world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Will," she whispered, her voice trembling, "when I left Jack, it wasn't just because he was cruel. It was because of what I found." She told him everything. How she'd stumbled upon a hidden room in the basement of Jack's ranch house. A room with chains on the wall, and a small, leather-bound ledger hidden under a loose floorboard. It was a book, Will, a list of names. Girls' names. Beside each name was a price and a destination. Cities I'd never even heard of. He wasn't just a monster. He was selling people. Will's face went pale as a ghost. He looked like he'd been shot all over again. "Was her name in it?" he choked out. "Sarah Dawson. Was it in the book?" Emily's heart broke for him. She nodded slowly. "It was. Near the beginning. Next to it was a name. A place. The Gilded Cage." But then came the twist she hadn't seen coming. "The book," Will said, his voice a strained whisper. "Where is it now?" Emily's eyes widened. I don't have it. When I ran, I was so scared. I just left it there, hidden under the floorboard." A new kind of horror dawned on them both. The proof of Jack's crimes, the only thing that could clear their names and expose the truth about Sarah, was sitting in the belly of the beast, at Jack Malone's ranch, the one place on earth they could never go back to. But they had to. Their journey was a nightmare. They traveled by night, hiding during the day, stealing food where they could. Will's wounds festered, a constant burning reminder of their race against time. He was getting weaker. Emily knew they didn't have long. They finally reached the ridge overlooking the Malone ranch. It was a fortress. Dozens of men patrolled the grounds, all armed, all loyal to Jack. They weren't just ranch hands. They were guards. It was an impossible situation, a suicidal mission. As they lay hidden in the rocks, watching the ranch, a lone rider approached the main gate. It was Sheriff Brody. He dismounted, greeted by Jack's foreman like an old friend. They clapped each other on the back and went inside together. The law wasn't just on Jack's side. The law was his partner. Despair washed over Emily. It was over. They had failed. But Will wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at the foreman. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a dark, simmering rage. "I know that man," Will rasped, his voice thin with fever. "His name is Marcus Cole. He worked for me years ago. The day Sarah disappeared, he disappeared too. It wasn't just a ledger. It wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. Jack's entire operation, the evil that had stolen Will's daughter, was still running. And the man in charge was the same man who had betrayed Will all those years ago. The mission had changed. This wasn't just about finding a book anymore. This was about tearing down an empire of evil, piece by piece. But how could two wounded fugitives take down an army? The answer came from an unexpected place. As they watched the ranch, Emily noticed something. A small, unmarked wagon that came and went from a side gate every evening, driven by an old woman. It was too small for supplies, too regular to be a random visitor. It was a pattern, and Jack had taught her that patterns were weaknesses you could exploit. That night, they didn't attack the ranch. They attacked the wagon. It was a desperate, clumsy ambush. But the old woman was not a fighter. Inside the wagon, they didn't find goods. They found a girl, no older than 16, terrified and gagged. She was the latest delivery for Jack's network, and she told them everything about the secret tunnels under the ranch, about the weekly shipments, about a place called the Gilded Cage, a high-end saloon and brothel in a city 300 miles away, run by a woman known only as the Countess. It was the hub of the entire operation. Suddenly, they had a choice. Go back for the ledger, a suicide mission for the sake of proof, or follow the trail forward, a desperate gamble to find Sarah and the other girls. Will looked at Emily, fever burning in his eyes. The ledger can't save my daughter, but maybe we still can. They let the girl go, gave her what little money they had, and pointed her in the direction of a town far away from Jack's influence. Then they turned their backs on the Malone ranch and the ledger hidden within it. They were no longer running from the past. They were chasing a ghost, heading straight into the heart of an evil far bigger and more organized than they had ever imagined. They had no proof, no allies, and no names. Just a destination, the Gilded Cage. The city was a sprawling, chaotic mess of noise and light, a world away from the silent plains they knew. It was a place where fortunes were made, and lives were lost and forgotten with equal ease. Finding the Gilded Cage was easy. It was the most opulent, infamous saloon on the Barbary coast. Getting inside was another matter. Will was too sick. The fever from his wounds had taken hold, leaving him weak and shivering in a cheap boarding house room. The burden fell on Emily. She had to do this alone. She sold the last of their meager possessions for a decent dress. She walked through the ornate doors of the Gilded Cage not as a victim, but as someone looking for work. She was hired as a saloon girl, serving whiskey to men whose faces were a blur of greed and entitlement. The place was run by the Countess, a woman of ice and iron. She was beautiful, elegant, and her eyes held a cruelty that rivaled Jack Malone's. Emily knew instantly that this woman was the key. For weeks, Emily played her part. She served drinks. She listened. She learned the rhythms of the place. She learned which guards were lazy, which doors were always locked, and which whispers held the most weight. She heard rumors of girls kept upstairs, special inventory for the wealthiest clients. She had to get upstairs. Her chance came during a high-stakes poker game. A rich cattle baron, drunk and arrogant, was being cheated by the house dealer. Emily, using a simple trick she'd learned from her own father, subtly exposed the cheat. The baron was furious, but grateful to her. He demanded the Countess reward the honest girl. As her reward, Emily asked for a position with more responsibility, a position that would take her upstairs. The Countess agreed, but her eyes were cold, suspicious. Emily knew she was now on a razor's edge. One wrong move, and she would disappear just like all the other girls. Upstairs was a different world. It was a luxurious prison. The girls were dressed in silk and jewels, but their eyes were empty, haunted. Emily searched every face, looking for any sign of Sarah Dawson. She found nothing. She was running out of time. Will was getting worse, and the Countess was watching her every move. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. One of the other girls, a quiet, frightened girl named Lily, recognized the look in Emily's eyes, the look of someone searching. One night, Lily slipped a small folded note into Emily's hand. The note contained a single word: cellar. The cellar was forbidden territory. It was where the Countess kept her secrets locked away. Using a key she had stolen and duplicated, Emily slipped down into the damp, cold darkness beneath the saloon. And there she found it. Not girls in chains, but ledgers, dozens of them. The entire history of the operation, stretching back years. Every name, every price, every destination. She frantically searched for Sarah Dawson's name, and she found it. But the information next to it wasn't a destination. It was a note. Sent to the Valquez mines, punishment for defiance. And next to that, another name. The man who took her there, Marcus Cole, Jack Malone's foreman, the man who was now running his ranch. The truth hit Emily like a tidal wave. Sarah wasn't here. She had never been here. She had fought back, just like Emily had. And for that, she'd been sent to a place worse than any saloon, a death sentence in a silver mine. And Marcus Cole was the key to finding her. He wasn't just Jack's successor. He was the one who had personally delivered Sarah to her fate. But as Emily stood in that cellar, clutching the ledger, she heard footsteps on the stairs. The door creaked open, and the Countess stood there, a small pistol in her hand, a cold smile on her face. "I knew you were too clever to be a simple saloon girl," she said. "Looking for something?" Emily was trapped. The proof she held was a death sentence, but then all hell broke loose. Shouts erupted from the saloon above, gunshots, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. Will Dawson, looking like a ghost risen from the grave, stood in the doorway of the gilded cage. He was pale, shaking, but in his hands were 2 revolvers, and in his eyes was the fire of a man with nothing left to lose. He had come for her. In the chaos, Emily made her move. She threw a heavy crate at the Countess, knocking the pistol from her hand. She grabbed the ledger with Sarah's name and ran up the stairs into the middle of a full-blown gunfight. Will had brought help. A handful of grizzled old-timers from the boarding house, men with their own scores to settle with the city's corruption. They were outgunned, but they were fighting with a righteous fury. Emily and Will reunited in the smoke and chaos. They fought their way out, the ledgers clutched in Emily's hands. They escaped into the night, leaving the gilded cage in flames behind them. They had the proof. They had a name. And they had a new, even more dangerous destination. They had to go back to where it all began, back to the Malone Ranch. They had to find Marcus Cole. The journey back was a fever dream. Will, running on pure grit, was fading fast. The ledgers they'd stolen from the Countess were a heavy burden, a testament to hundreds of stolen lives. They told a story of a vast network, with buyers and sellers in every corner of the territory. Jack Malone and the Countess were just 2 heads of a monstrous hydra, but one name kept appearing: Valquez, the owner of the silver mines. A man so powerful, so protected, that his name was only ever whispered. He was the final customer, the top of the food chain. When they finally staggered back to the small town near the Malone Ranch, they didn't find allies. They found fear. Sheriff Brody, enraged by the destruction of the gilded cage, had put a bounty on their heads. They were now wanted for murder, arson, and theft. Their faces were on posters in every saloon and general store. There was nowhere left to run. They found refuge with an old doctor who had known Will for years, a man who owed him his life. He tended to Will's wounds, shaking his head at the infection that had taken hold. "He needs to rest, Emily, or he'll die." But they had no time for rest. Marcus Cole was at the Malone Ranch, consolidating his new power, and he had something they needed. He was the only person alive who knew the exact location of the Valquez mines. Emily knew she couldn't storm the ranch again. She had to be smarter. She had learned from Jack, from the Countess. She knew how to use their own cruelty, their own greed, against them. She found a desperate, down-on-his-luck ranch hand who had recently been fired by Cole. She gave him a choice, a pouch of gold or a shallow grave. He chose the gold. Her plan was simple and insane. The ranch hand rode up to the Malone Ranch, claiming he had captured the wanted woman, Emily Carter. He told Cole she was tied up in a ravine a mile away, and he wanted the bounty money. Greed was a powerful motivator. Cole, wanting the glory and the money for himself, didn't send his men. He rode out alone, just as Emily had predicted. He found the ravine. But he didn't find Emily tied up. He found Will Dawson propped up against a rock, a rifle in his lap. his face pale, but his eyes burning with a cold, patient hatred. It was a trap. While Cole was distracted, Emily snuck into the Malone ranch house. It was a ghost house now, filled with the echoes of her past trauma. But she wasn't the same woman who had fled this place. She moved with purpose. She knew what she was looking for. She found it in Jack's old office, a hidden safe, and inside, not the ledger she'd left behind, but maps. Detailed maps of the territory with routes and locations circled. And one location, deep in the treacherous mountain country, was marked with a single name, Valquez. She had it, the location of the mines. But as she turned to leave, she heard a gunshot from the direction of the ravine. A single, final shot. Her heart pounded in her chest. She raced out of the house, back toward the trap. She found them at the bottom of the ravine. Marcus Cole was dead, a bullet hole in his chest, and Will was slumped against the rock, his rifle fallen from his hands. He was looking up at the sky, a faint, peaceful smile on his face. A dark stain was spreading across his stomach. Cole had gotten off one last desperate shot. Emily rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Will, no!" He looked at her, his eyes losing their focus. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. A picture of a smiling young girl with his same kind eyes. "Sarah," he whispered. "Find her. Don't let them win." His hand went limp. His eyes closed. And William Dawson was gone. Emily sat there, in the silence of the ravine, the maps in one hand, the photograph in the other. She was completely, utterly alone. She had lost her friend, her protector, her partner. The evil she was fighting had taken everything from her. She could give up. She could take the maps and disappear. No one would blame her. But looking at the picture of Sarah, she saw her own reflection. Another life stolen by the same darkness. And she heard Will's last words echoing in her ears. "Don't let them win." Her grief hardened into something else, something cold and sharp and unbreakable. This was no longer about survival. It was no longer about justice. This was about vengeance. She buried Will next to the ravine, under a pile of stones. Then she took his guns, his horse, and the maps, and she rode toward the mountains. She was no longer Emily Carter, the victim. She was a hunter, and she was going to burn Valquez's world to the ground. The Valquez mines were a scar on the face of the mountains, a place of dust and misery where men were worked to death for a few specks of silver. But the real treasure wasn't in the ground. It was in the locked barracks where the special laborers were kept. Emily didn't ride in with guns blazing. She was one woman against an army of guards. She used the knowledge from the ledgers, the cunning she'd learned in her fight for survival. She observed. She waited. She learned that Valquez himself was a paranoid recluse who rarely left his fortified villa overlooking the mines. His one weakness was a weekly delivery of laudanum for his nerves, brought by a single trusted courier. Emily intercepted the courier on a lonely mountain pass. She took his clothes, his cart, and his delivery. She walked through the main gates of the Valquez villa dressed as the courier, her face hidden by a low-brimmed hat. No one gave her a second glance. She was invisible. She found Valquez in his study, a fat, sweating man surrounded by luxury. He barely looked up as she entered. "Leave it on the table," he grunted. But Emily didn't leave. She drew Will's revolver, the cold steel a familiar weight in her hand. "I have a different delivery for you," she said. Valquez's eyes went wide with fear. He opened his mouth to scream for his guards. He never got the chance. With Valquez dead, the chain of command was broken. Chaos erupted. Emily used the confusion to her advantage. She started a fire in the supply shed, a massive blaze that drew every guard away from the barracks. She shot the locks off the barracks doors and threw them open. Inside, she found them. Dozens of women, their spirits broken, their eyes empty. They were the forgotten ones, the names in the ledgers. She searched their faces, her heart pounding. And then she saw her. Older, thinner, her hair streaked with gray, but it was her. the same kind eyes from the photograph. "Sarah?" Emily whispered. The woman looked up, confused. "Who are you?" "Your father sent me," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "Will Dawson. He never stopped looking for you." She led them out of the burning camp, a small, ragged army of survivors. They disappeared into the mountains as the Valquez Empire crumbled into ash behind them. Weeks later, a carefully prepared package arrived at the office of a U.S. Marshal in San Francisco. It contained the Countess's ledgers, Jack Malone's maps, and a detailed, anonymous letter explaining the entire human trafficking network. The story was too big to ignore. The investigation that followed brought down corrupt sheriffs, wealthy businessmen, and powerful politicians across the territory. The Hydra was dead. Emily and Sarah made a new life for themselves in a small, quiet town far away, a place where no one knew their names or the horrors they had survived. The ghosts of the past would always be with them, but they were free. They had each other. Emily had kept her promise to Will. She hadn't let them win. She had taken on an empire of evil, armed with nothing but courage and a refusal to be broken. She had proven that even in the darkest of nights, a single spark of defiance can be enough to start a fire that burns the whole rotten world down. What about you? When faced with an evil that seems too big, too powerful to fight, do you turn away? Or do you find that spark inside you? This story shows us that true strength isn't about the absence of fear. It's about acting in spite of it. It's about fighting for those who can't and honoring the memory of those we've lost. If this journey into the dark heart of the frontier moved you, if you felt the fire of Emily's fight and the depth of Will's hope, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss our next tale, because justice may be slow out here, but it always, eventually, finds its mark.